Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm, and in this video we are actually going to explore Photoshop. We're going to explore the Photoshop interface. We're going to talk about what all of the things do. We're going to talk about our tools and the options we have available to us, so on and so forth. So this is the first screen you should see when you open up Photoshop for the first time. And it will ask you to, do you want to create a new document? Do you want to open a document that you already have? Do you want to learn? The Learn button is great because it allows you to go through tutorials where it'll teach you how to do specific things. These are pretty great. But for us, we're actually going to just click Create New. Now, when I click Create New, I have my most recent options here. For me, I'm not going to want the most recent options because I was doing some game development and I set up my canvas to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels because my art assets were really tiny, and so I don't want my previous options. But let's go over some options up here. So we have preset details. You can create a preset based on these options here, so you can use it. If it's something you're using over and over again, you can create a preset. We have width and height and orientation. We can also select what unit of measurement we're using. So are we using pixels or inches or centimeters, millimeters, points, picas, so on and so forth. For us, we're only going to really focus on pixels or inches. Now, pixels are going to be anything that we produce that needs to be used digitally, right? So if I'm creating something that's going to be shown on screen on a if I'm making something for a web page or something that's only going to be displayed on a computer, then we're going to use pixels. But if it's something that we're going to print, like a flyer or a brochure or a poster, then we're going to want to use inches. For this, I'm going to choose inches, and I'm just going to make this 11 inches wide by 8.5 inches tall, and it's going to be landscape orientation. Those of you who are you may already notice that I'm basically creating a piece of paper, right? A standard piece of paper is 8.5 inches wide by 11 inches tall, but I'm flipping it on its side. Resolution, you just want to generally keep this at 300 pixels per inch. If you're doing something on the web, you can lower it to 72 pixels per inch, and that'll be fine. That'll keep your file sizes smaller, but I just generally keep it at 300. Color mode. This one is really important as well. So for RGB color, you have a couple of different color modes. Now, RGB color is really the color mode we're going to use if we're developing something for the internet, for the web. Now, because I'm using inches, I know I'm going to be developing a document for printing. So what you want to use instead is CMYK color. And the reason for that is because CMYK color is what printers use for their color. Now, 8-bit is generally fine, but I always like to bump it up to 16-bit color just so we get a bit more color depth. Background contents. So let's say we want this to just be a white background or a red background from the very beginning or whatever, or black or whatever. We can set that right here in these options, or I can choose transparent, which means my background is see-through, right? I'm just going to choose a white background. That's fine. And I'm going to click Create. And it's going to take a second, and then it will create my document. Okay, so here's my new document. This is blank. There's nothing here. But let's go ahead and explore this interface a bit. So up here at the top, we have File, which will give us options like save your work, export your work to something new, print your work, things like that. In Edit, we have some options for preferences overall for the application itself. We have some options for cutting, copying, pasting, that kind of stuff. One option we're going to use a lot is called Free Transform. That's here in Edit, or the Control T is the keyboard shortcut for that. Image. These are options that are specifically related to the image that you are using now, that you're manipulating right now. So the size of your overall canvas, the rotation of your image, things like that. In Layer, we have options specific to the layer that you're working in. We're going to talk about layers here in a minute. Then you have Type, which is your text, your type. Select, this will give you options with your selection that you've made. We haven't made any selection yet, but when you make a selection using, say, your marquee tool here, you will get options in the select to either deselect or do the inverse of your selection, stuff like that. I'm going to Control D to deselect. Then we have filters. We can apply filters to the overall document itself. We can make things blurry, noisy, pixelated, that kind of stuff. We have 3D options, which I'll be honest, I don't really play around with 3D options in Photoshop too much. I've never really done 3D work in Photoshop. We have view, where you can change your view, and window, where you can change your workspace. So I'm actually going to use a different workspace. Let's go to the painting workspace, which is the one I like to be in for the most part. Now, I'm noticing an issue with my camera here. I'm kind of covering up important information. So I'm going to move my face over here, so it's a bit easier to see what we're looking at. Okay, so now that we have our workspace set up the way we want it, now let's start talking about all these panels. Now, one thing that is really important is that you can click and drag and move these panels wherever you want. You can move these around anywhere you want on your screen, and they'll just kind of snap into place. All right. Okay, so up here we have, this is a context-sensitive menu up here based on the tool that we have selected. Notice that I have my Marquee Select tool up here, and so these are options related to the Marquee Select tool. If I select my Move tool, then that changes, right? Let's talk about these tools here. Notice that in this toolbar, some of these options have a little arrow by them. That means if I click and hold, I'll get an option to select other tools. For example, I have my Move tool and an Artboard tool. The Artboard tool works differently from the Move tool, right? So just know that some of the tools that you might be looking for may be hidden behind some of these other options. For example, rectangular marquee or elliptical marquee. We have the lasso or the polygonal lasso. Object select, quick select, or magic wand. We're actually going to use the magic wand in our first product or in our first assignment. Now, here's another thing. Notice that I've hovered over it, but I haven't selected anything. It'll give you a very quick video demonstration of how that tool is used. For example, the object selection tool will allow us to select objects, and then we can make changes to that object specifically. We have the crop tool. We have eyedroppers, the paintbrush, the pencil, color replacement, mixer brush, stamp tool, history brush, eraser, paint bucket, blur, smudge, sponge, text, and all this stuff. We're going to explore what most of this stuff means as we go through it. Down here we have our color selector, so I can choose my primary or foreground color, and I can choose my background color, and then I can create objects with those two colors inside of them. So let's do something there. And it's thinking for a second. So notice that my foreground color is now the fill color of my rectangle is that foreground color that I selected, and I can quickly swap between background and foreground colors just by doing this here. Okay, now over here we have properties. The properties panel is going to show us more options for the object we have selected. So I have a shape selected, so I have some properties for my shape itself. I can change the height and width just by typing in the values here. I can change the fill color very quickly. I can change the stroke. Right now it has no stroke, so let's give it a little bit of a stroke. Let's give it like, let's say 5 pixels stroke. And so notice now I have a black outline around my shape. I can change the stroke style, so maybe I want it to be dotted like that, and maybe I want my stroke to be a little bit bigger. So let's do 10 pixels, so it's much more pronounced. Okay, perfect. So the properties panel will give you some options that you can change. Now notice that up here I have relatively the same options, right? So you may not even want the properties panel to be taking up space because your options over here exist as well. I also have swatches here. Swatches are really important if you have a design that you want. And when we get into color, we're going to talk more about swatches, but that's not until later. But swatches will allow you to just load in a specific set of colors for a project, and then you can use those colors specifically. Notice that when I hover over these colors here, it automatically turns into the eyedropper tool. So that helps me to keep my colors organized, and I can very quickly select them. I have brushes down here. Brushes are really important, especially for painting and stuff like that. I do a lot of digital painting in Photoshop, and so I like having my brushes menu right here where I can quickly select brushes. Down here we have layers. Layers are incredibly important in Photoshop. Here's how you should think of layers. Layers are like clear. So have you ever seen a teacher, an old school teacher maybe, that has an overhead projector and they have these clear plastic projections and they place one down and then another one on top of it, and you can tell they're two distinct layers, but when you see it on the projector, they just look like they're on top of, they don't even look like they're separate layers. That's exactly what this is, right? So you might have a layer on the bottom in Photoshop and then something that goes on top of it, and they look like they're together, but they're actually on separate layers. Photoshop is very, very heavily built around using layers. So down here I have my rectangle 1 is on a different layer from my background. So if I was to, let's go to my background, and I'm going to unlock my background layer here. I clicked one too many times. And I'm going to use my paint bucket tool here to fill in my background layer with this blue. Notice that if I select my rectangle layer, I can move that around on this blue background, and I'm not disrupting any of the background, any of the layer 0, right? I can even make changes to this layer, and it won't really affect anything on the layer below it. So let's grab a brush, and I'm going to change the color to, let's go to like a yellow. And then I'm just going to, oh, it's telling me that I can't. Sometimes if you try to do use a brush in Photoshop, you'll get this symbol for your cursor. And if I try to click, it'll say the shape layer must be rasterized before proceeding. Do you want to rasterize the shape? Sorry, excuse me. Rasterization is something we're going to talk about a lot next week, so I'm not going to dig too deep into it right now. Just know that in order to draw on an object or do certain changes to an object, you need to rasterize it. So I'm going to click yes. Now I get my brush. I'm going to make it a bit bigger just so it's easier to see. And then I can just start coloring on that layer. Now, it looks like I'm coloring on the background, right? But I'm really not. If I grab my move tool again, I can move that top layer, but again, notice the background is not selected because we're on the specific layer. And if I hide this layer by clicking the eyeball, I can see that my background is completely undisturbed. Layers are incredibly powerful, okay? And we're going to use layers a ton in this class. There are a lot of options here in Photoshop that you might want to play around with and check out. For example, we can apply layer effects by clicking the FX button down here. You know, we can do all kinds of things like apply a stroke to our layer, which that doesn't look great. We can do bevel and emboss, which doesn't really seem to make a change on this layer or the options we have there. It made something. You can see a little bit of a bevel. Let's see, let's try satin. Make it a little bit more satiny. That looks gross. Inner glow. This one is one I use all the time, especially for something that I want to, you know, look like it's actually like glowing. And you can change the options in here in your effect menu. I'm actually going to turn off that effect. Now, effects are different from filters. A filter will apply to the entire thing that you're making, whereas effects will only affect a specific layer and the layers below them. So if we apply, for example, a Gaussian blur effect to this, or Gaussian blur filter to this thing, it'll apply to everything on my presentation or on my thing, on my document, whatever it is I'm making. Pixelate, this one's fun. We'll do some pixelation. We'll make it grainy dots and pixelate my whole thing. Ooh, that's fun. That's cool. Anyway, play around with the filters, play around with the effects. We're not going to get into layer masks until a little bit later, but you can play around with those too. Play around with all the tools you have, check out what they do. Definitely play around with the brushes. Brushes are really important. So we're you know, I'm just going to let you just explore this on your own. Just know that this menu up here is context sensitive. Layers are down here. And if you want to use the same layout as me, I'm using the painting workspace. Photography workspace might also be useful for you if you want to do that. I mean, there are all kinds of different workspaces. Find a workspace you like. Let's see. We could do 3 up vertical. Oh no, tile all horizontally. No, I'm not going to mess around with that too much. I am going to primarily work in the painting workspace. So if you want to follow along with me exactly how my screen looks, then that's the workspace I mostly use. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to let you fart around with this and play around with it and see what you come up with. And then in the next video, we're actually going to get into making our first power standard. All right, thanks for paying attention. Peace.